Mudbox has a powerful new dynamic tessellation feature set that allows you to create detailed concept models like these from low poly primitives, like a sphere or a plane. Before we dig into what dynamic tessellation is and how to go about using it in Mudbox, let's first take a look at the common sculpting problem that this sets out to solve. If we turn wireframe on, we can see that this low poly plane primitive has just 100 faces. Let's say you want to create a tree trunk using this plane as a base. As you pull at the surface, your polygons begin to stretch out of shape, and you quickly run out of geometry to work with. Subdividing your mesh at this point doesn't really solve the problem. Not only are you increasing the resolution of your model by 4 times every time you subdivide, you still don't get the shape you originally set out to create. Let's undo that. Try a different approach. Now let's say you start by adding several subdivision levels beforehand. At first glance, this seems to solve the problem. You've got the shape you want. But when you try to extend those shapes further from their original form, you'll once again run out of geometry. Previously, the only real solution to this problem was to create your basic topology in a separate application, like 3ds Max or Maya, before bringing it into Mudbox to work on lower level detailing. Dynamic tessellation now allows you to do all of your concept work exclusively in Mudbox, starting from primitives, by dynamically adding topology only where you need it. Start by expanding the new Tessellation section found in most Mudbox sculpting tools. Enable Tessellate. You'll notice a number of settings now become available to you. But you can ignore these for now. The defaults are already well suited for most applications anyway. As soon as you click on a mesh with a Tessellation enabled sculpting tool, Mudbox will run a check to see if the mesh is compatible. In this case, since the mesh is made up of quad faces, a new tessellation mesh needs to be generated to continue. In the object list, you'll notice your original mesh is now hidden, and the new tessellated copy is visible and ready for sculpting. As soon as you click on the mesh, the area of the surface within the brush radius is tessellated to a higher density. There's a short fall off along the brush radius that connects the higher density area with its lower density surroundings. With tessellation enabled, the grab tool is not only modifying the shape of the surface, but also progressively tessellating it. As you drag further away from the surface, the mesh is dynamically retessellating every step of the way, ensuring that triangles are not stretched beyond a certain threshold. As you continue to pull apart the mesh, triangles are being generated on the fly, only where they're needed. Alright, so let's put Mudbox Dynamic Tessellation to work. Let's create a high-resolution concept model of a tree character, beginning once again with a simple plane made up of 100 faces. We'll start by enabling tessellation for the grab tool. Turn it on in the Properties panel or by simply pressing tilde on your keyboard. A small T appears below the cursor to indicate that tessellation is enabled. Turn on Follow Path to drag out extensions of your mesh along the path of your brush stroke. This works really well with dynamic tessellation. Alright, let's get to it. Let's begin building our tree character concept. First step, generate a tessellation mesh. Now let's draw out our first stroke and create a curved tree trunk. This trunk could be thicker, so let's switch to the bulge tool. Now you might have noticed that the surface is no longer tessellating as it's being sculpted. That's because tessellation is disabled for this tool. For each sculpting tool, decide whether or not you want to dynamically tessellate the surface as you sculpt. This setting is unique per tool. Now the surface tessellates as it gets thicker. Need more resolution? Zoom in. By default, the closer you are to your mesh, the smaller your triangles, and therefore the more refined your mesh will be as you sculpt. Let's give this tree trunk a bit more of an organic shape by bulging out certain parts of its surface. We can use the wax tool to flatten out the tip of the tree trunk. and then switch back to the bulge tool to thicken the perimeter of this stump. From here, we'll continue using tessellation-enabled tools to further refine the form of our tree trunk. Experiment with using the various tools with tessellation to bring character to your tree trunk. It's up to you what you do here. Just let your creativity flow. You can even use stamps to get some texture if you like. The tessellation respects them too. You can interactively adjust the tool's divide threshold directly in the view by using the N hotkey. Drag to increase or decrease the size of the in-view triangle to set the tool's divide threshold. Now that I set a small divide threshold, the surface gets more densely tessellated as I sculpt on it. Similarly, increasing the triangle size leads to a more sparsely tessellated surface because the divide threshold is much larger now. Click the middle mouse button while holding down the N key and hovering over your mesh to sample that area's tessellation density. Now as you sculpt, you're using the divide threshold sourced from a specific part of your mesh. By default, all sculpting tools share the same tessellation settings. Hover over any of these to get detailed information about how each of them work. Instead of using screen pixels as your units, you can take a more absolute approach to tessellation by switching to world space units. Now, as you sculpt, your tessellation settings are no longer relative to how close or far away you are from your mesh. Basically, your divide threshold is now a fixed value. Again, Mudbox artists find that the default settings for tessellation work just fine for most applications. So much so you often won't need to tweak any settings during your entire workflow. For quick access, you can toggle tessellation on and off using Mudbox's hotbox. Alright, let's add our first branch to this tree trunk using the grab tool. And now let's use the bulge tool to make the surface of this branch more irregular and tree-like. Now we'll add some geometry between the branch and trunk to make a more natural connection between the two. The closer we get to the mesh, the more detail we can add. Polygons are being generated on the fly as we draw new paths for these smaller branches to grow along. You'll find yourself often switching back and forth between the grab and bulge tools when sculpting organic surfaces like this tree. And with tessellation on for both tools, you can stop worrying about the underlying topology and let Mudbox take care of all of that for you. All you need to do is simply focus on your sculpting, finding that final form your model is going to take, without having to predict it beforehand. Use Shift at any time to smooth the surface, as you normally would in Mudbox. And you may find it optimal to use the Smooth tool without tessellation enabled. Remember, the bulge tool is your friend when things get too skinny. How many branches and what type you add is up to you. Are you creating Old Man Willow or more of a slender sapling? Experiment with adding branches and twigs of different sizes, remembering to zoom in to get more tessellation where you need more detail. Alright, let's zoom out and take a moment to understand what we've been able to accomplish here with dynamic tessellation. We've added quite a bit of detail to what's only a very small part of this model. And as we zoom out further, we can see how truly microscopic these details are in relation to the whole mesh. Traditionally, the entire mesh would have needed to be subdivided to the level of the finest detail, costing us millions of polygons. Instead, this mesh is currently only 73,000 polys. Now let's use the wax tool to give this tree a more painterly appearance. I can use this tool to build up some of the areas with broad strokes. Once again, polygons are only added where they're needed, so our count remains low. At this point, I'll be using the same techniques I've shown so far to further the shape of the surface of the tree. Extend some branches with the grab tool. Add volume to those branches using the bulge and smooth tools. And continue to create even more branches, add more detail, and further define the shape and form of this tree, which, as a reminder, was once a simple 100 polyface primitive plane. Of course, you can also use dynamic tessellation to cut away at a surface, to create depressions in it, and even subtract detail. After about an hour of sculpting so far, we have a high detail concept model of a tree that's just over 200,000 polys. Alright, now our tree character needs a face. We'll start by using an inverted sculpt tool with tessellation enabled to progressively create a cavity for the mouth. Let's use the smooth tool, again with tessellation disabled, to smooth out the perimeter of the mouth. We can then use the bulge tool to create an upper lip for our character. Let's draw some roots, and now the lower lip. And use the grab tool to shape the lips, or even go back to creating some more branches. That's the beauty of concept modeling with dynamic tessellation. You work the way you want to. Make artistic choices at any point in time, concentrating on the creative process instead of struggling with technical limitations. Okay, let's get back to sculpting the mouth. We'll use the sculpt tool to create the upper and lower gums. We can then use the grab tool to pull in some crooked teeth. To bulge out these teeth without affecting anything around them, let's freeze the gum line. All tessellation-enabled sculpting tools respect the areas on the mesh that have been frozen using the freeze tool. In other words, the surface will not be moved or tessellated when it's frozen. Let's use the wax tool to flatten these teeth and the grab tool to shape them. Alternatively, we can freeze the teeth if we want to instead pull the gums around the base of them. Use the bulge tool to thicken the gum line around the base of the teeth without affecting the teeth themselves. And now we have teeth. Let's move on to the eyes. Just as we did for the mouth cavity, we'll use an inverted sculpt tool to create a couple of cavities for his eyes. And we'll repeat that until we've got deep enough sockets. Next, we'll use the grab tool to give the eyes a bit more of an expressive look to them. A tree character's eyelashes would most likely be twig-like, so let's add a few using our tessellation-enabled grab tool. Keep in mind, as we create these very thin and wispy surfaces, a voxel-based solution wouldn't support this without subdividing the entire mesh to the same level of detail. Only dynamic tessellation gives you this kind of freedom with volume and scale while sculpting. Now let's create another set of branching eyelashes. We'll use the same techniques of grabbing, bulging, smoothing, and dynamically tessellating the surface. We can use the wax tool to harden certain areas of the surface. Next, our tree guy needs a nose. We'll use a tessellation-enabled sculpt tool to take care of that. Let's add a bit of volume with the bulge tool. And finally, let's give this guy some eyes. Just a couple of simple spheres to move into place within the eye sockets. And we're done. We managed to create a concept model of a tree character starting from a low poly plane using dynamic tessellation. Now it's your turn. Create something awesome and post it to our gallery. Thanks for watching.